Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me. And as my obsession grew, I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons.
While the term serial killer is not formalized by any legal code, the crimes of serial killers have often been seized by the media and the public consciousness, especially in cases where there are many victims or the murders are carried out in a gruesome fashion. From a policeman turned serial killer to the most prolific murderer in the United States, there are plenty of terrifying serial killers that have stolen newspaper headlines over the years. Join us today as we look at 3 different tiers of serial killers, categorized by their number of victims. Tier 1, 1 to 20. Albert Fish. When a serial killer is dubbed the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Gray Man, and the Boogeyman, it's almost certain he is thoroughly deranged. Fish was tried and found guilty of raping, killing, and cannibalizing 3 children in the early 1900s. However, he claimed that he had murdered more than 100 children and even boasted that he had children in every state. Especially deranged is the fact that Fish sent a letter to the mother of one of his victims, 10-year-old Grace Budd. The letter detailed how he had lured the little girl, strangled her, and then cut her into pieces to eat over the course of 9 days. Ed Kemper. Known as the co-ed killer, Edmund Kemper brutally murdered at least 10 people in California during the 1960s and 70s. The signs were there from the beginning. As a boy, Edmund Kemper killed animals, decapitated his sister's dolls, and invented disgusting games. And at age 15, he even murdered his grandparents. But when Kemper later confessed to killing 6 female hitchhikers as well as his mother and her best friend, the police didn't believe him at first. They knew and liked Big Ed, the 6'9" man who seemed like a gentle giant. In truth, he was anything but. Kemper was a cunning serial killer who raped corpses, mutilated dead bodies, and buried his victims' heads in his backyard. His high IQ of 145 only made him more dangerous, as he used his intelligence to slip away from his crime scenes undetected. Joseph James DAngelo. Though his crimes occurred decades ago between 1974 and 1986, Joseph James DAngelo wasn't identified as the Golden State Killer until DNA evidence from one of the crimes was used to match with a close relative of DAngelo's, which led to his identification and arrest. Over the course of 3 separate crime sprees, DAngelo murdered at least 13 people, raped more than 50, and committed well over 100 burglaries. One of the reasons why DAngelo was able to evade identification and capture for so long is because he was a former police officer. Yes, you heard that right. His training undoubtedly helped him in planning and executing his crimes while minimizing the physical evidence he left behind. In fact, he was known to have called some of his victims months before he attacked them, so he could learn about their routines to more effectively plan his crimes. In some instances, he even broke into the homes of his victims so he could unlock the doors and windows and even leave items like ropes and other ligatures he could use to tie up his victims upon his return. One of the most chilling aspects of DAngelo's crimes is that he often taunted his victims, staying for hours in their homes, ransacking it, eating their food, and threatening to kill their families. In some cases, he targeted couples, whom he would separate. He would sometimes force the female victim to tie up the male victim. He would then place plates on the male victim's back so he could hear if the victim tried to move. DAngelo would then commence in raping the female victim in another room. Joachim Kroll. German serial killer Joachim Kroll murdered at least 14 people, including young children between 1955 and 1976. After strangling his victims with his bare hands, Kroll would have sex with their corpses, then cut them up into pieces to eat. Interestingly, Kroll was finally caught after a neighbor complained about a backup in the plumbing. The pipes were clogged with human remains. When Kroll was arrested, he was in the process of simmering body parts taken from his most recent victim, 4-year-old Marion Ketter. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer started killing in 1978, just 18 years old, and wasn't arrested for murder until 1991, after a would-be victim escaped and led police back to Dahmer's Milwaukee, Wisconsin home. It was there that some of the gruesome details of his life of killing were seen via photos of mutilated bodies and body parts strewn across the apartment. He even had a vat of acid he used to dispose of victims. In all, Dahmer killed 17 people, mostly young men of color. He served time in prison twice, the first time for molestation and the second time for murder. His chilling documentary is one of the most famous ones among serial killers. He explained how he wanted to collect parts of his victims and that he just viewed them as objects.
It's a process that doesn't happen overnight. When you depersonalize another person and view them as just an object for pleasure instead of a living, breathing human being, it seems to make it easier.
Dahmer was killed by a fellow inmate in 1994. Tier 2, 20 to 50. H. Holmes. Chicago has had its share of killers, but perhaps none more haunting than H. Holmes, the pharmacist who turned a hotel into a torture castle. Ahead of the 1893 World's Fair, Holmes moved to Chicago and started outfitting a 3-story hotel with all manner of nefarious contraptions, including gas lines, secret passages, and trap doors, hallways to dead ends, chutes to the basement, soundproof padding, and torture devices strewn throughout a maze. The gas allowed Holmes to knock out his guests before the worst of what was to happen came next, often on his surgical tables. He then burned the bodies in the building's furnace, selling skeletons to medical schools, and running life insurance scams. In all, he copped to more than 30 murders, found only after a fellow scammer turned him in for falling short on a financial agreement, before he was hanged in 1896. Anthony Laurette. Technically, Anthony Laurette was convicted of killing one person in St. Charles, Missouri in 1980, but he later confessed to 31 murders in 11 states dating back to the late 1960s. 15 of those cases were closed based on details he gave to authorities. Laurette, shown in this 1976 police booking photograph, met several times with Pinellas County Detective Patricia Joe, giving her details into more than 24 rapes, attacks, and killings. The state of Missouri executed Laurette by lethal injection. John Wayne Gacy. A construction worker known by his suburban neighbors as outgoing, John Wayne Gacy was involved in politics and even acted as a clown for birthday parties. He was no clown. Gacy came under suspicion in 1978 when a 15-year-old boy last seen with him went missing. That wasn't the only time families of missing boys had pointed fingers at Gacy, but it was the first time authorities took them seriously. Soon after, a search warrant granted police access to the Gacy home, with a smell of nearly 30 bodies buried in a 4-foot crawl space under his home. He was convicted of 33 counts of murder, with additional counts of and torture, and was executed by lethal injection in 1994. Tier 3, 50 plus. Samuel Little. Samuel Little surpassed even such lethal predators as Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy to become the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history, while going undetected for decades. Many of Mr. Little's victims were marginalized, young black women who were estranged from their families and struggled with poverty and addiction. In many cases, their deaths did not draw the same level of attention or outrage as other killings, even though it was later found out that Samuel Little killed 50 people. What's crazier is that he could have easily killed up to 90. Only in recent years did Mr. Little confess to the killings from a prison cell in California, his 3rd stint in a state prison. He said that he had strangled his victims, many of whose deaths had originally been ruled overdoses or attributed to accidental or undetermined causes. The recounting of his crimes came after a Texas Ranger seeking information approached Mr. Little. He even became visibly excited as he discussed the killings. Asked by a detective about a woman he said he had killed in North Little Rock, Arkansas in 1994, Mr. Little responded,
"Oh man, I loved her. I forget her name. Oh wait, I think it was Ruth.
Okay.
She was a heavy set, big old yellow hair, and had buck teeth. It had a gap between the teeth, that's what it was. And she was like honey colored skin, and she had her hair was not really long."
Andrei Chicotillo. Between 1978 and 1990, the Russian serial killer Andrei Chicotillo assaulted, murdered, and mutilated more than 50 young women and children. Chicotillo killed his victims by stabbing and slashing them with a knife. One of the youngest was 9 years old. Chicotillo later admitted that he was only able to achieve orgasm by stabbing women, a fact which made it difficult for him to resist his strong urges to kill. Chicotillo was nicknamed the Butcher of Rostov, Red Ripper, and the Rostov Ripper. Though he confessed to a total of 55 brutal murders, he was tried for 53, sentenced to death and executed by firing squad in 1994. Pedro Lopez. Pedro Lopez's deranged killing spree is terrifying enough, but perhaps even more terrifying is the fact that Lopez's current whereabouts are unknown. The official figure of his killings is 110 people, according to the authorities. But the native of Colombia claimed to have raped and killed more than 300 women across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. At least 100 of these were tribal women. In 1980, the monster of the Andes was arrested and led police to the graves of 53 victims between the ages of 9 and 12. Lopez was found guilty of murdering 110 girls in Ecuador. He also confessed to an additional 240 murders in Peru and Colombia, and was declared insane. Incredibly, Lopez was released in 1998 for good behavior, and while there are plenty of rumors, no one can confirm exactly where he is today. Harold Shipman. Nicknamed Dr. Death, Harold Shipman is thought to be responsible for murdering 218 of his patients between 1972 and 1998. In reality, the number of people he murdered is likely much higher. As a practicing physician, Shipman had easy access to potential victims, which is why he was able to be such a prolific killer without raising suspicion. However, because Shipman was involved in so many cases in which patients died, people eventually began to suspect foul play. Most of his victims were elderly women, whom he said had died in their sleep, but many of these women died during the day, which struck some as odd. Additionally, Shipman asked for an unusually large number of cremation certificates, which caught the attention of an undertaker who reported the odd circumstances of the cremations. Eventually, Shipman was convicted in 2000, but only after a victim's daughter reported that he tried to write a will for the victim that would name him as the beneficiary. He died by suicide in prison in 2004. Which one of these killers terrified you the most? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it and also subscribe to our channel for your regular dose of whodunits. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Until then, stay safe, stay cool, and don't get any crazy ideas.